Okay, we're going to go into some other classification systems now. And remember, the crux of it all is the type of classification system that we use depends on the job we're trying to do, because we're trying to organize and understand things, in this case living things, in order to either name them or manage them or understand how to help them when it comes to reproducing them or using them in agriculture or whatever. The classification systems that we use, each one has a purpose, and we choose when we're investigating something in order to try and manage it or look after it or understand it, we choose a classification system to organize everything in that thing we're investigating based on the job at hand. Okay, so when it comes to trying to help species, either if you're in agriculture and stuff and you're trying to actually breed things up, or if you're an environmentalist and trying to save a species that's on the brink of extinction, we're talking about reproduction here, as well as how they live and what sort of environmental conditions they need in order to survive. If you're trying to help them to reproduce and increase in numbers, we have to look at their reproductive strategies. So we have a classification systems for reproductive strategies, because each one of those strategies is quite different, and how you handle them and manage them is quite different too, based on how they're classified. You've already met two of these strategies, asexual and sexual, whether you reproduce with yourself or whether you reproduce with another individual. So they're ones that you've even seen in grade 8. So asexual, one parent; sexual, two parents. Very different in how they work. Asexual will be fine if they're in the middle of nowhere without another organism to reproduce and mate with. Sexual must have at least two, a male and a female, otherwise you're a bit stuck. And some organisms, i.e. plants, because they can't move around, often use both mechanisms. They'll use sexual most of the time and asexual to get them out of issues where they can't easily find a mate, i.e. they're the only plant left. So sexual has many good points to it. The genetic change and recombination every generation means that it's harder for things to attack us on a cellular level, like bacteria and that. They might figure out how to get into your parents' cells, but because your cells are different, they can't figure out how to get into yours, essentially. So sexual reproduction is actually very strong at keeping us ahead of organisms that are trying to attack us. However, sexual reproduction can happen even when only one animal in that, or not one animal, one organism in that species is left. So there are pros and cons to both, and you handle them both very differently. So that's the first strategy. The second strategy is this RNK Strategies. Now this is to do with how often an organism will breed in its lifetime, whether it has lots and lots of offspring with a low survival rate, or whether it actually puts in an awful lot of parental care and stuff. So these guys are very specific strategies, and we call them K and R strategies. I can't remember what the K and R mean, I just remember K and R strategies. K strategies I remember easily, because K strategists are like humans. They have low numbers of offspring and they have high parental care. So basically they put an awful lot of energy into their offspring. They don't have a lot of them, but there is a high survival rate. They also tend to breed later in life. They actually have to grow and mature before they can have offspring. So they are in a very different category to the ones that we call R strategists. These are the guys that have very short lifespans. They actually start breeding quite quickly after birth. They have lots and lots of children, and they don't care for a whit for any one of them. If they live, they die. They don't care as long as they've laid their eggs or whatever. So R strategies are quite different from K strategies, and we have to handle them differently. K strategies, like us, we tend to do well in environments that are quite stable. However, you give an unstable environment where things are changing all the time, and our survival doesn't always, we don't always survive long enough in order to mature and have offspring. So in an unstable environment, K strategists don't work so well. However, R strategists tend to survive no matter what. Even if the environment is changing, they are constantly changing as well, because they have very short lifespans and a very quick turnover in offspring. So these guys actually do quite well in unstable environments. So they're things like your bacteria, even small aquatic organisms and stuff like frogs and stuff, or insects. They have a very short lifespan and they breed prolifically, okay? So R strategists are very different to K strategists. You might think breeding like rabbits, I was just thinking that then, breeding like rabbits would be an R strategist because there's a high turnover. No, high parental care. Rabbits care for their offspring. They're actually a very quick version of a K strategist, okay? R strategists, the key criteria is high numbers of offspring, and I'm not talking 10 or 20, I'm talking thousands to tens of thousands, but low parental care is the other thing that you have to look for. Now, if we're trying to help organisms reproduce and stuff, managing these two groups, as you might understand now, is very different because their parental care, the number of offspring and stuff that they have, it is all quite different. So management of these two groups has to be different as well. Some other classification systems that we often have, you've known since grade 10, they're species interaction classification systems. So there's two main ones that we look at: symbiotic interactions and feeding relationships. So symbiotic interactions are basically two organisms not feeding on each other. Do they help each other, harm each other, or one really doesn't care? So we start with, down the bottom here, we have mutualism, where both benefit each other. So in the case of the flower here, the bee gets some food off the flower, and the flower actually gets pollinated and has its sperm, which is pollen, spread to other flowers so that it can sexually reproduce. So that's a mutualistic relationship. We have parasitic, where one organism benefits and the other one is harmed. A parasitic relationship would be like this one here. That lichen on that tree bark there, it's actually eating the tree bark. The tree is actually being harmed by that if it goes too far into the bark and actually breaks through its first layer of defense for its immune system. So it's actually being harmed and the lichen is being helped. So we call that a parasitic relationship. If the relationship goes to a point with parasitism where it's causing a disease, that means the normal functioning of the body is actually affected and reduced because of that relationship. We call it a pathogenic relationship. So a good example of that would be any type of sickness that you get, okay, say the cold or the flu or something. That's definitely a parasitic relationship where one organism is benefiting and the other is not. Disease, when disease is formed, we call it pathogenic. Commensalism is where one organism benefits and the other one really doesn't care. Okay, so that's this one here. So this whale shark here, his presence is actually protecting these little guys here, these fish that swim alongside him. They're actually protected while they're beside him. He doesn't use them for lunch. They just use him as a safe haven. However, without him, they'd be in a lot of trouble. Other organisms, other fish and stuff would eat them, but he really doesn't care if they're there. So they just swim with him. He does his own thing. He doesn't care that they're there, but they benefit from his presence. Another type of relationship, of course, are the feeding relationships. There's competition, where two organisms, or two different species in this case, want the same thing. So it could be competition for nests, it could be competition for trees, it could be competition for food. But it's competition where you're both competing for the same resource. And then it comes down to the specific feeding relationships. Predation. Actually, I shouldn't have had competition under feeding relationships because it's not always about feeding. So we'll change that in your notes. Predation is where one organism eats another. Pretty easy. Predator-prey relationships.